All right, we are recording. So welcome everyone for joining me this afternoon for Growing Food the Water-Wise Way on behalf of Our Water, Our World, and in partnership with the Vallejo Flood and Wastewater District and Fairfield Sassoon Sewer District. I am Suzanne Bontempo. I am the program manager for Our Water, Our World. And I'm very excited to talk to you about how to grow food with a water-wise approach. It is something that I talk about on a regular basis and one of my favorite topics to share information on. So welcome. You know, growing food with a water-wise approach is a lot easier than we might think. So today, we're going to go through slides for about 45 minutes. I do have a lot of content I'm going to share with you, but then I'm going to leave time for your questions. So as questions come up, don't hesitate to pop them in the Q&A or pop them in the chat. Okay. And then I will address them at the end of our program. What we're going to learn today is how to increase the health of our garden, how to water efficiently and effectively, how to plant a water-wise veggie garden, why working with cover crops really helps support a water-wise garden, and then which food crops are the most water-wise, and then we'll talk about some additional resources. So just to start off, for those of you that are not familiar with the Our Water, Our World program, we are a program that was designed to bring education between pesticides and water quality. We partner with the water pollution prevention agencies and retail stores. So you might see our racks or recognize some of our materials because they're in your local retailers. We're in garden centers as well as hardware stores. And we'll always have this rack of fact sheets that you see here in the picture on the left. Please help yourself to those. Those are going to walk you through sustainable pest management approaches for certain topics such as ants, aphids, rats, and mice, and how to grow beautiful lawns with a less toxic approach, how to grow beautiful roses with a less toxic approach. So I'm sorry, I was distracted. Someone's emailing. Anyway, and you can also access these on the Our Water, Our World website. You might also recognize our little shelf talkers that we put underneath the eco-friendly products. That will ensure and let you know that that is going to be a product that is not going to pose any harm to our waterways. It will be less toxic for your family, for your children, and your pets. So since Our Water, Our World is an integrated pest management educational program, I always like to start by talking a little bit about integrated pest management. So integrated pest management, or IPM, is a decision-making process that uses science-based strategies, okay? And in this case, we're going to be looking at the system as the garden. We're going to be looking at the garden as a whole. And then when problems come up, we really want to try to identify what is the problem as opposed to the symptom of the problem. Oftentimes what we see are the symptoms of the problems. And then from there, we ask ourselves, is this something we can live with? So for instance, right now, I just noticed that those annual spittle bugs are out in the garden on some of my plants. Those are the little bugs that actually look like someone spit on your plants. It's kind of weird. They make a little frothy home for themselves. And it is something I can live with because I know that they are doing minimal, if any, plant damage. And I also know I could just blast them off with a hose if they end up being too much of a nuisance. So that's a really great example. But then if there is a problem, if there is an excessive infestation of like aphids or whiteflies, scale, and other pests, then we might need to take action. And when we take action, it's going to be a combination of actions. And those are called cultural controls, which is bolstering the health of the environment, which we're going to talk a lot about today. Mechanical controls, which are the tools that we use to manage pests. Biological controls, which are the living organisms we use to manage pests, and then chemical controls, which are the pesticides. We're always going to use these as a last resort. We're always going to use the least toxic possible. And I just also like to share, if you have a plant in your garden that has never quite performed to your liking, or it has always struggled, maybe it's getting a little too much shade or a little too much sun, or maybe it's outgrown its location, give yourself permission just to remove that plant. You can give it to a friend. You can just chuck it in the green waste bin. And then now you can give yourself permission to buy a plant or replace a plant that is going to be more suitable for that location. And that's really going to, I don't know, be the perfect plant for you. So as we start, I'd just like to share that I'm really going to talk about how we can set our vegetable gardens up for success and how we apply IPM methods for growing food with a water-wise approach. And I'm going to share that it all starts with the soil. The more time and effort we put into the soil, the healthier the soil is going to be, the more water it's going to be able to hold on to in a healthy way. And overall, it's going to increase the health of the plants. So they're going to be able to withstand a lot of heat and drought stress, as well as other pest problems. And so let's just start by talking a little bit about soil basics. Soil is made up of 4 components. It's going to be the mineral particles, water, air, and organic matter. So we have here about 5% organic matter, and that's really ideal soil. That's really what our goal is. That's what we want to kind of get to. Now, soil texture. Now, this might be, this is related to that question if anyone's ever asked you, what kind of soil do you have? So soil texture is made up of sand, silt, and clay, and any combination of those 3. So sand is going to be large particles with large pore spaces or larger air spaces. And if we ever, if we have the experience of sand and we water, that water just kind of goes straight through. And then silt is going to be the soil texture that has medium-sized particles and medium-sized pore spaces. And then clay is going to have very, very, very small particles, almost microscopic, and they are going to pack together very tightly. There's going to be very little space between them. And if you have clay, you notice when you water, the water does not infiltrate very quickly. In fact, a lot of times it'll stop. It takes a long time for that water to absorb. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But then we have something else, which is soil structure. Soil structure is how those soil components kind of fit together. And what we're striving for is to have a really good soil structure that allows for water and air and nutrients to infiltrate into the soil, but also allows the soil to stick together in a way that it won't crumble, but then also is not so tightly packed that roots can grow with ease. Earthworms and other microorganisms can move around with ease. And that's what we're trying to achieve. And we can do this by amending the soil with compost. Compost is going to be the win-win no matter what type of soil you have. When we add compost, we're able to add this rich organic material that is going to improve the soil structure. It also increases the health of the soil and the microbiology that's in the soil. And when we add compost, we're actually inoculating that soil with more microbiology. So we're increasing the diversity of that. When we are able to add compost to the soil, we're able to increase the health of the plants, and we're also able to increase water holding capacity. Now, you might think that's kind of weird for clay, but I got to tell you, when we add compost to clay, it allows that water to infiltrate with more ease. Now, the way we add compost to our soil, if it is a new planting area, we are going to lay out about 2 inches of compost on top of the soil. And then we're going to work that into the top 6 inches of the soil. So the beautiful thing, a fork or a shovel is typically about 10-ish inches. And when we're working that top layer of compost into our existing soil, now we are integrating it in to the top 8 inches, which means we've just added 25% compost to our soil, which is beautiful. The microorganisms are going to take over and they're going to continue to integrate that compost a little deeper and throughout the soil. So I just wanted to share that. Now, if we have an area that's already planted and we're planting plants, we are going to amend the soil as we plant. So that means we're going to dig that hole. We're going to amend the soil with a shovel or two of compost, work that in, and then plant the plant. Now, if we have an existing area that has established plants and we're not adding any more plants, then a great way to get compost into the soil is just laying out compost a nice inch or two underneath a nice layer of mulch. And then over time, that is going to work its way into your existing soil. Again, we never want to bring it around the crown of the plant. The crown is where the trunk and the root system, or the above ground part of the plant and the root system meet. We always want that area to be clear and free of compost, soil, mulch, leaf debris, leaf litter, any of that. We just want to make sure that there's nice air circulation there. Now, if we are going to our local retailer, we might see bags of soil that we can use to amend. And these are going to be bags of compost, but they don't always say compost on the bag. Sometimes they'll say soil amendment or soil conditioner or planting mix or raised bed mix. So these are all going to be components that we can amend our soil with. These are all composts, which are loaded with a lot of really good organic humus that are going to be ideal for our gardens. And what we're trying to achieve is to get more beneficial bacteria and fungi into our soil, because when we have more beneficial fungi and bacteria, we're able to they're able to break down organic materials, store nutrients in the soil, break down toxins and pollutants, and hold that soil together to reduce erosion and other things like that. So there's a couple of things you might be familiar with. If you've ever planted like fava beans or other legumes, you know that they have these little nodes on the root systems that's actually fixed nitrogen bacteria, which is really cool. It's a great way to get more nitrogen into your soil. And then, of course, mycorrhizal fungi, which is this webbing network of almost hair-like organisms that spread around and attach themselves to the roots of the plants. And when they do this, they're actually increasing the surface area of that root. So that root now can take up more nutrients and more moisture on an as-need basis at its convenience and just when it needs it. It's very cool. So we're also going to look at organic fertilizers. We want to feed our plants with organic fertilizers. It's the most sustainable way to feed our plants. And the main reason why is because, and especially during a drought time, it is going to support the microorganisms in the soil. It's almost as if it's feeding the microorganisms, and it's going to then be able to have those microorganisms enhance that symbiotic relationship that they have with your plant root systems. Also, I can share, because it's feeding at a more natural rate, it's going to prevent a lot of stimulation of new growth. So unlike synthetic fertilizers, which are very high, which act like steroids, synthetic fertilizers are going to stimulate a lot of new growth. And when we have a lot of new growth always being stimulated, and we're always having these little growth spurts, the plants is going to attract a lot of insect pests because the new growth is still very tender and it's loaded with a lot of plant sugars. And that's exactly what pest insects like aphids and such enjoy. So we want to prevent that by working and feeding our organic fertilizers into the soil. I can also share that synthetic fertilizers have a tendency to be very high in salts. So if we are not watering deeply and really able to flush that synthetic fertilizer through the soil, or if we have heavy clay and it's really getting stuck, over time, we're going to have salt buildup on the top couple inches of soil that's going to be quite detrimental to our plants. I can also share that this organic fertilizer will not run into our waterways. It will not pollute our waterways. And it is going to be a more holistic way to feed our plants. So this is a little bit of an illustration of what I was talking about. So chemical fertilizers are going to just strictly feed the root systems of the plants. It's not supporting the soil. It's not feeding the microbiology in the soil. And because of that, that plant becomes dependent on that chemical fertilizer. And so you'll have to always apply according to the label's instructions. Whereas organic fertilizers, we are feeding the microbiology in the soil, which in turn is then supporting that root system. And that plant is able to take the nutrients when it needs it. We will not have to fertilize as often because those nutrients are going to be locked in that soil for quite a while. Something else I can share that's really going to improve the overall health of your food gardens is that vegetables love alfalfa meal. It supercharges your plants. And it's not just limited to vegetables. You could put this around your fruit trees, your berries. You can even feed your roses with alfalfa meal. This is going to be in addition to that organic fertilizer that we've worked into the soil. And I typically do about equal parts. So if I'm adding about a quarter cup of organic, like all-purpose or fertilizer for vegetables, I'm also going to add about a quarter cup of the alfalfa meal. It adds nitrogen and trace minerals to your soil that is above and beyond the other fertilizer blends. It improves the tilth of your soil, which is what we're trying to achieve. And it also contains a natural fatty acid growth stimulant. So it's going to increase and stimulate the growth of healthy, new, strong cells. Earthworm castings is going to be another win for your garden. It is a superfood for our food crops. And it contains an abundance of nutrients and mineral essential for our plant growth and essential for our plants to thrive. So when we work a couple tablespoons of earthworm castings into the soil around our plants, there are enzymes and beneficial bacteria that is in the earthworm castings that is going to bolster the health of that plant and work through the cell structure of the plant to prevent pest insects and inhibit diseases. So this is key because as we go into a dry summer, and if we happen to have a couple days of excessive heat, that can stress the plants out. But if the plants have these vitamins and nutrients that we can feed them, and through organic fertilizers, alfalfa meal, and earthworm castings, they're going to be very resilient to any type of drought stresses. Then through the growing season for my annual vegetable crops, I am going to mix and feed with a liquid organic fertilizer. So what I do is I mix it in my watering can with some water according to the label's instructions. And it's very easy for me to water it into my vegetables around the soil of where they're growing. And I can do this about once a month or twice a month. And what this does, it allows me to avoid disturbing any of the root systems. Because when we apply the dry fertilizer, we will have to scratch it into the top inch or two. Whereas this, we're just watering it in, and we don't have to disturb the roots. If it's for perennial food crops or like fruit trees and vines, and berries and such, then I might just, do it once a month or maybe once every other month, depending on the plant and how much food it is giving me. I can also share that there's this really cool fertilizer out there that I just learned about this. I love this brand. They're very good quality. They make a product called Ocean Gold, and it is high in calcium. So if you're looking for a natural way to get calcium into the soil, some vegetables like tomatoes really thrive with a little bit of calcium. This is an excellent way to get some calcium into the soil for your plants. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is mulch. So mulch is a protective layer of organic material that I'm going to put on top of the soil. Now, mulch can be compost, but in this case, what I'm referring to is something like wood chips or rice straw. The wood chips are we could buy it in a bag at our local retailer. It could be things like fir bark chips or arbor mulch or cedar. Or I like to use, if we live near a feed store, you can get a rice straw, which we can kind of spread it out and mat it around our vegetables. It's a really great way to get a layer of mulch down that's going to not break down very quickly. Mulch is pretty fantastic because when we're working with a wood chip mulch, it's going to add nutrients to the soil. As it breaks down, it's actually feeding the soil. It's going to reduce weed seeds from germinating. And if weeds do grow, they're a heck of a lot easier to pull out. We're going to, when we have a layer of mulch on top of the soil, we are reducing the evaporation rate substantially. We also are reducing soil compaction and erosion. And more importantly, we are keeping that soil cool in the summer and warm in the winter. But if we happen to have clay, if you've ever seen that where the clay, if it does not have mulch on top, and after, a couple days of high heat and high sun, it turns into concrete. It seems like it's so hard, we can't even get a pickaxe into it. If we were to get rain or if we were to water, that water would just sheet right off that soil. When we have mulch on top, it protects that soil and prevents that soil from creating that crust. So then when we do water or when we do get rain, that water is able to infiltrate. But as I mentioned before, we want to make sure that mulch is away from the plants. Typically, I'll go from thumb to pinky. Or if it's a tree or a large shrub, I will go hand to elbow. All right, now we're going to talk about the planning. This is the fun part. I always like to take note how much sun I have. So I might think I have full sun, or I might think I've got a lot of shade, but I really want to go out there and watch. I want to see how that sun is moving, and I want to see what's going on. When is the sun shining in that area of the garden where I want to grow my veggies? So keep in mind that full sun is going to be 6 hours of direct sunlight, and part sun or part shade is 3 to 6 hours of direct sunlight. But ideally, this is going to be the morning sun. So we're looking at direct sunlight from maybe from 8 a.m. to noon, or from 7 a.m. to noon, something like that, or from 9 to 1. When the first part of the day, the sun is much cooler than the second half of the day. If we have part sun for the second half of the day, that's going to be a little trickier. So when you buy your vegetables, or when you are making your plan to add vegetables to those areas, they're going to be vegetables that really can handle the heat if it's that second half of the day. Dappled sun, of course, is filtered sun all day. And then shade is going to be no direct sunlight. And what I'd like to share, I point this out, is because when we go to the store, we go to our garden center, we see these little tags in the plants, and these tags give us a lot of information. They're going to tell us the sun exposure, how big that plant's going to get. When it comes to food crops, how many days to harvest. It's also going to let us know if it's a perennial or an annual, and how much water it's going to require. So these really are key. Next, I want to share that when we plant in raised beds, we're saving water. Believe it or not, it's amazing. So when we plant in raised beds, we can now add the type of soil we want, so we can control the soil. We can use that nice, beautiful, rich raised bed mix that we can purchase. We're also able to line the bottom with gopher wire or half-inch hardware cloth, so it will protect the root systems from gophers nibbling. We are now able to localize the water because we're only watering in this area of that raised bed. We know we have good drainage, so that's going to be ideal for growing healthy root systems. And soil compaction is not an issue. So it's kind of cool. It also helps if we've got sore backs, or if we, have those tender knees, we can have the raised beds a little taller for us. Now, another thing I like to share is, believe it or not, we want to plant slightly close together. Now, that is a little tricky because when we buy our plants, they're tiny. So that's why it's so important to know about how big are these plants going to get, because we kind of want them to be, elbow to elbow. We don't want them shoulder to shoulder, but elbow to elbow is going to be really nice. We kind of want them to slightly overlap. We're going to plant them in clusters on a diamond grid or a hex grid. And this is really helpful, okay? We can get more food per square foot, but we're also able to have these plants grow, and they're going to be shading the soil a little sooner, a little earlier than they would when they're fully mature. When they're shading the soil, they're keeping the soil cool, and they're also reducing the water evaporation rate even more. And they're creating a really cool kind of microclimate within them. Then as we harvest, we will be harvesting every other one. We're almost thinning the plants, and that's our harvest. And then it'll allow the other plants that remain to continue to grow and mature. And that is how we'll harvest. We'll kind of thin it, and more plants will grow. We'll thin them, and so forth. And then we're going to look at which plants are best. This is fun. I'm a huge fan of heirloom veggies. Heirloom vegetables, many of them are from Mediterranean regions, which is ideal for our climate. They're typically more drought tolerant, which means they're water savers. So it's really cool. Right now, lucky for us, heirlooms are trending. We can see so many heirloom varieties right now in the garden centers and in the seed packs and so forth. So check it out. Give yourself, get curious. Maybe plant a couple heirloom varieties that are new to you. It's really fun. And if you're not familiar with the National Heirloom Expo that typically happens every September in Santa Rosa at the fairgrounds, didn't last year because of COVID. Hopefully it will this year. It is an amazing festival. It is really fantastic. It's fun. It's great. And it's better than any county fair, I just got to say. Now, there are a number of annual vegetables that we love growing. It's our leafy greens, radishes, potatoes, chard, kale, lettuces, mustard greens. These can be water wise when we plant them closer together and have mulch and other tricks I'm going to teach you in a minute. For all of you that love summer squash, there's a really cool variety that is an heirloom. This is the Tatuma. It's a summer squash. It's an heirloom from Mexico. It handles and can tolerate hot baking sun and dry conditions. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't require water. It's still going to require some water, but it's a tough summer squash, and it's going to give you a lot of food. We harvest it young, as shown in the picture on the left, as a summer squash, just like zucchini and so forth. And then we can also keep it on the vine for it to mature, and then we can harvest it later as a winter squash. It's amazing. It's delicious. Other annual crops would be arugula. Arugula really handles extremely well in dry, hot conditions. Beets, carrots, cucumbers, onions, tomatoes. Yes, tomatoes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about tomatoes if you are growing a typical, just like a zucchini, a yellow summer squash, we have a tendency to set our irrigation systems or water when they're young every day, which is what we want to do. But as those plants mature, we're going to talk about this more, we can reduce how often we water. And I'll share, if your tomatoes are prone to getting whitefly come July or August, that is sometimes an indicator that the soil is not drying out enough for that plant. And it is attracting that whitefly because that plant is stressed. All right. Another cool thing we can do is grow perennial veggies. So perennial vegetables such as asparagus, artichokes, scarlet runner beans, rhubarb, sorrel, and chives, and the walking onions, these all require very little care. And they are also going to be very low water once established. So it's kind of cool that you can have food that you plant it once and you fertilize it maybe once or twice a year with that dry fertilizer, maybe hit it, add a little bit of liquid fertilizer a couple times throughout the growing season, and they take care of themselves. It's pretty fantastic. Garlic is going to be another really fun, very low water plant. I'm a huge fan of garlic. I started planting it. I didn't realize how fun it was for me to really dive into these different heirlooms from around different parts of the world. We plant it in October or November when we start to get those cooler, shorter days. Really cooler nights. The days we still might get like those Indian summers where we get hot days, but it's when those night temperatures start to cool just around Halloween. And then we harvest in June or July. That is a long time to commit to growing some garlic, but I can share it is so fun. And we are not adding that much water. If we haven't had any rain in about a week or two, then we water that bed nicely, and then we don't think about it again. Scarlet runner beans are another really fun perennial. Yes, so these are bean. We are going to, I call it a 3-season bean. We're going to harvest them young, just like a green bean. We are going to harvest them when they're a little bit more mature. That's going to be more like a stew bean. So something we'd want to put in soups and stews. And then we can also let it dry on the vine, and we can harvest the seeds as a dry bean for the winter months to make like refried scarlet runner beans, or, mix it into soups and stews. This is fantastic. It's a lot of fun for the whole family because I like to share it when the green pods are really large, and I know that those beans inside are brightly colored with this like fuchsia and black. I will invite kids to come over and harvest some magic beans. They open up and their eyes get huge because this is very unusual. We don't usually see these magical, brilliant beans, but it's a lot of fun and they're delicious. So now I'm going to talk about working with cover crops, because cover crops are going to really give you a lot of bang for your buck. My favorite and the easiest one that I find the easiest one for me to work with are fava beans. Fava beans are kind of a win-win because, I'm planting them typically in the fall. I'm going to plant them in any parts of the garden that I have removed those summer vegetable plants. So if it's my summer squash, or if it's my tomatoes, or if it's my cucumbers, or if I have a bed that is, I'm not planting lettuce in, or whatever, a container, or wherever I have a little empty space, I'm going to dot the fava beans in, and I'm going to have that grow as my cover crop. The wonderful thing about fava beans is when the greens start to grow and the plant is young, I like to harvest the tips. I'll cut about 3 or 4 inches off the top, chop that up, saute it with sesame oil and garlic. It's delicious. Of course, you can have some areas where it's designated for growing the plants so that they go into bean. In this case, it's not going to be a cover crop, but we can then harvest the beans to eat the fava beans as a food, or we can keep them on the stalk and let them dry so that we have beans to plant for the next season. The reason why I say that, when we're using it as a cover crop, we're taking advantage of those little nodulars, those little nodes of nitrogen that I mentioned before. So these little white dots that you see that might look like perlite, that's actually the nitrogen fixed bacteria. And the cool thing about legumes and fava beans is that they create this because those beans, it takes a lot of energy for that plant to create and grow those beans. So as the plant is young, it is starting to store and develop this nitrogen fixed bacteria. When that plant goes to flower, the flowers get pollinated, they start to develop more, they go through their life cycle, they start to develop the bean, and then once that bean is starting to develop, all of this nitrogen goes shooting from the roots up to the bean for that food. Now, if we want to capture that nitrogen for any future crops like my tomatoes or my summer squash or my, leafy greens, I'm going to cut the plant at the base right when it starts to flower. Now that sounds crazy, but we want to, just when the plant starts to flower, we want to cut it at the base. Then we can use the tops and we can chop it into our compost or use it as green manure. It's a wonderful food source for the garden soil. But it's also, now we have the root system that has that nitrogen. And when we plant our next vegetable crop, we're going to plant it just off center. So as the root systems of that new veggie crop grow, it's going to weave into the root system of the fava bean plant and capture all of that free nitrogen. It's amazing. And then I'd also like to share is that we don't want to forget about planting flowers. Flowers are so important because they invite our beneficial insects. When we plant flowers that are those of like little clusters of small flowers like yarrow or alyssum, or flowers that look like daisies or sunflowers like cosmos and so forth, we are able to invite a large diversity of beneficial insects and pollinators, which is so important to our food crops. It really helps us keep the balance by those beneficial insects are going to be eating and eliminating many of the pest insects. So that means we don't have to use as many pesticides. And we're attracting pollinators that are going to increase our harvest yields, which is so fantastic. And I want to share, this is a zucchini, and I get this question every summer. People ask me, my zucchinis are rotting from the end, and I'm so scared that I have a fungus in my soil, or my soil's contaminated, or I got a bad plant. Is there anything I can do to correct this fungus? And I have to break it to them. This is from lack of pollinators, okay? Or maybe we had an abundance of pollinators and maybe this little fruit was hiding. So understand that without flowering plants around our garden, it's going to be really hard for the pollinators to zone in on the plants we want them to pollinate for us. Now, if this is the case, there are wonderful tutorial YouTube videos online that you can watch that will teach you how to pollinate. You can hand pollinate with a little paintbrush, the male to the female flower, if you are having this problem, or just plant some more flowers in the area. The pollinators will take care of it for you. So now we're going to talk about how to plant and how to water. So when we buy plants, I know this is a lissom, but this was my best photo I could come up with for today. When we buy plants at the garden center, typically we pull them out and the root system is in the shape of the pot it came in, either a cell pack or a 4-inch, even a 1-gallon. So it's really important before we plant it to tease those roots. So we're going to go back to this tool. This tool is so helpful. We're going to tease those roots. We're going to try to open them up so that we can encourage them to start to grow out before we plant the plant. And then when we water, understand the root system is very tiny at first, but we want to encourage the root system to grow wide and deep. And that root system is only going to go where the water goes. So it's really important that we water wide and deep. So as the plants grow, we're going to expand the water further out, and we're going to apply more volume of water. And then we're not going to water as often as the plants mature. So we want to, it's going to get a little challenging for us if we have sandy soil, because water is just going to rush right through it. So we might want to water and then stop and water and stop so that we can really make sure water is getting within the root zone. We always want to gauge water to get down about 5 inches, and then it will expand and continue to go a little deeper. Loamy soil or any combination of that is typically not an issue, but clay soil is going to be a little bit of a challenge, because when we water, after a certain amount of time, the water seems to pool on top, and we might think, hey, that's all we need to give it, but that's not true. It's just, it takes a little longer for that water to infiltrate. So we're going to have to pulse that water out. We're going to have to give it a little time, wait for that water to absorb, and then water again, and then wait, and then water again and wait. So here's another illustration of how water kind of moves through different types of soil. And when we're planting plants, we want to make sure we're planting plants with similar water needs together, as well as similar microclimate needs. So we want to make sure we're planting full sun plants together, shade plants together. Of course, if we've got a big plant that's in the full sun that's casting shade, we want to keep that in mind. And then also understand the different zones of the garden that might have some wind tunnels or might have a little bit more heat. And we want to increase our permeable surfaces. So we can do this by adding gravel or doing or increasing our walkways with bricks and flagstone that is not mortared in, or we can work with decomposed granite. The reason why this is so important is because, like, for instance, in this walkway, those plants are on the edge, but the root systems are not stopping at that edge. It's going under the walkway. And it's the same thing with the raised bed. We will have a raised bed. The root systems will go beyond that raised bed, but those roots are also going to grow out, possibly underneath the walkway. And when we have a permeable surface, that water is able to move through that soil and continue to enhance the health of the soil and the overall plants. Many of us have drip irrigation systems. Some of us do not. But I just like to share that drip irrigation systems are going to be the most effective way to water and the most efficient way to water. And the reason why is because we're able to take advantage of the emitters, the way the water is coming out of the tubing, and direct it right to the plants that we want to water. We also are making direct contact with the soil, so that means we've got less water evaporation rate. Because we're only watering the desirable plants, we have a tendency to see less weeds because we're not favoring or watering areas of the garden that there might be weed seeds that would like the water. We also are going to set the irrigation clocks to water early in the morning. And the ideal time to water is going to be somewhere between like 4 and like maybe 7 a.m. This gives the water to the plants when the air and the soil is cool, but it's going to evaporate enough before that evening so that there isn't going to be a lot of moisture on the ground that would maybe invite diseases. We can also set the clock for multiple start times. So in the case of sand or clay, we can pulse that water out. Now, some of us don't have those wired in controllers that might be in the garage or the side of the house. But there are these really cool battery and solar operated remote controls that I like to put attached to a hose bib, and then I can water certain areas of the garden remotely. Very helpful, very economical, and really easy to use. And what the irrigation looks like on the other side of the clock is going to be this tubing. So we have PE tubing, which is the picture on the right. That's typically about 1/2 inch. It's either just straight tubing that we can plug into, or you might have it where there's emitters in it that run about every foot or so, and that's going to release water at those junctions. Now, we also see on the picture on the left, 1/4 inch tubing, also called spaghetti tubing. And it has an emitter that's on the end of it. That emitter is what the flow rate is. And it's really important to understand what the flow rate is of our water when these systems are on. How much water is coming out at these emitters? Is it 1/2 gallon per hour? Is it 1 gallon per hour? Is it 2 gallons per hour? This is going to make a big difference on how you set your irrigation controllers, how long they're on for. Because if we have our system set for 30 minutes, a 1/2 gallon per hour is only going to release 1 quart of water, whereas a 2 gallon per hour emitter is going to be releasing 1 gallon. That's a huge difference. Now, something I like to share, and this came up after one of my programs a couple months ago, is that this person had watched the program and emailed me saying, hey, I had some landscapers install this line of Arborvitaes. They're beautiful. But after watching your program, I went out and I noticed that they have the emitter right at the trunk. And you had mentioned that we don't want anything at the crown. So something you can't see also is that there is a line up about 3 inches. The soil in the mulch was 3 inches up and the emitter was right there. Good thing she caught it. We adjusted that. She brought the emitters out and brought more emitters around so that it could provide water at the drip line. Now, this is also going to apply to a lot of your vegetables that grow really large. So like your tomatoes, your zucchinis, they start to grow really big. They're going to grow tall. In the case of tomatoes, they're going to grow really wide. In the case of zucchinis, you can imagine the root systems are growing almost as wide and almost as deep as those plants are tall. So as plants grow, we're going to want to bring those emitters out. And we might even need to add emitters. So we're making sure we're getting a nice all around even watering, and that we're watering deeply, and then we're not watering again until the top couple inches is dry. So because we live in these areas of California that can get pretty hot in the summer, it is not unusual for us to experience high heat days. What I mean is that heat that can be above 90 degrees and even go into the hundreds, right? So I just want to share, it's important that we protect our plants. When we have new fruit trees or new ornamental trees, we want to paint the bark with a paint, a protection. We can buy products like IV Organics, which is awesome, or we can make our own, which is going to be a latex to water 50-50 ratio of a paint that's light colored. It could be white, it could be pale yellow, it could be pale green, whatever, but it wants to be a light color. And we're going to paint that all the way up to the crotch of the plants where the branches start to split because anything above that, the canopy of that plant, that tree is shading it. So it's just going to be the trunk from the crotch down. And then when it comes to our food crops and other parts of our garden, when the temperatures get hot, it is not unusual for us to come home or go out in the garden and see plants that look wilted, but we know we've watered them. So do they need more water? Not always. So plants are going to show signs of stress in a couple of different ways. And one of them is by looking like it's wilted. This could be from dehydration. It could be from excessive heat. It can be from too cold. You know, when things get really, really cold, we see plants kind of like close up almost. So something I just like to share, it's really important that we utilize shade cloth. Shade cloth is going to help protect our plants through those excessive heat days, which it'll cast some shade, but it's still going to let sunlight through. We're attaching it in a way that it's high, so there's still air circulation, and that and then we don't typically have to increase our water. It is a good idea to always check the soil. And the way we do that is just by putting our fingers in the soil to see, is that soil dry? Do I need to water? And if we do, we're going to wait to the end of the day when the temperatures have cooled off a bit. But when it comes to buying shade cloth, if we are just buying, you know, if we are introducing plants to our garden that really are a little bit more sensitive to sun, then sometimes we might have shade cloth over those plants throughout the growing season, throughout the summer months. And that would be anywhere from a 10% to a 30%. But for our vegetable crops during the heat of the summer, we're looking for a 30 to 50% shade cloth, which would be ideal for protecting the vegetables. And then we want to make sure that we're not going to use anything that's higher than 40 to 60%. That's really the maximum. Anything more than that is just too much shade. Shade-loving plants really prefer a 75% or higher, depending on what the plant's needs are. And then just to keep it in perspective, what's ideal for us is something between an 80 and 90%. All right, so just to wrap up, tips on maintaining our water-wise garden, we are going to increase the health of the soil by adding compost. We're going to feed our food crops with organic fertilizers. We're going to water to encourage nice, deep root systems. And once those plants become more established, we can reduce how often we're watering. We're watering deeply, and then we're not watering again until the top few inches of the soil is dry. And then we're going to plant a variety of flowering plants to invite beneficial insects and pollinators. We're going to monitor for pest problems. We're going to harvest our food, and we're going to enjoy the bounty. So for some resources that you can check out, specifically when it comes to pest management, it's going to be the Our Water, Our World website, where you can find those fact sheets. And then for more information and a huge wealth of, on and on and on, so much support, a huge library is going to be at the UCIPM website that's really going to support us when it comes to pest management. And then a couple of books that I really love, which is the Sunset Western Garden Book of Edibles, Growing More Vegetables by John Jarvins, and then Gaia's Garden. These are really great books to add to your library. And then with that, I'd like to say thank you. We just learned a lot, right? I'd like to finish with your questions. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to drop them in the chat, put them in the Q&A. And I am going to